Okay, we carry on. Archaeology in the Bible. I think this is, we're in week 3. Now last week, we looked at various discoveries at the site of Tel El Daba in the Egyptian Delta. We're going to look at some more about that in a bit. But as I noted, that site, it was occupied for centuries, and it expanded during that time. And during that time, it was known by different names. It was known as Rawati, and then it was known as Avaris, and then it was known as Peru-Nefer, and then it was known as Ramesses. So this site that expands, goes in through the centuries, has these different names. And I suggested to you that the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, was Ahmose. And in 1560 BC, he succeeded in driving out the Hyksos, those Asiatic rulers who had taken over control of northern Egypt, and he expelled them from the country. And that was the beginning, you see there, of the 18th Egyptian dynasty. So when he succeeds in expelling those foreign rulers in 1560, that begins the 18th Egyptian dynasty. And he's the one, as I say, who in my judgment then didn't know Joseph, and he enslaved the Israelites. And I mentioned some of the evidence of Israelite presence in the Delta from other sites. Talked about that a bit. And when the bell rang, we just started to look at the store city of Pithom, which the Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 tells us the Israelite slaves were forced to build. Now, the store city of Pithom that those Israelite slaves were forced to build, that's thought by many scholars, I mentioned this last week, to be this site right here, that little dot, Tel El Rataba. That is the store city of Pithom. And that site I mentioned was excavated by Polish and Slovak archaeologists from 2008 to 2017. And it was discovered that around 1600 BC, so in the latter part of the Hyksos rule before they got kicked out, that in the latter part of the around 1600, that the city was founded and it was occupied by Semites originally from the Levant. Now remember where the Levant is. That's Canaan, Syria, Phoenicia, that region in there. The Egyptians would sometimes include Mesopotamia, but we're talking about Asiatics is the phrase they use, from the Levant. Okay, and so these are Semites, those people who spoke one of the Semitic languages, originally from the Levant. And they found there at that site that the adults were sometimes buried with sheep, which suggests that their sheep were important in the lives of these people. And you ought to start thinking, well, that's like shepherds. You see, so they have buried with sheep. And they also found that the Semitic population, both in the 15th dynasty at the end of the Hyksos period and then under Ahmose, the beginning of the 18th Egyptian dynasty, that in both of those times that they did not bury their infants in jars, which was a practice that was very common at that time in Canaan, but it wasn't typical of Israelite settlements. You didn't see them burying infants in jars. So all of those things are kind of interesting. Here's what Titus Kennedy says about the site. He says at the beginning of the 18th, this is an archaeologist, Titus Kennedy, he says at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, so that's Ahmose. Ahmose comes in, kicks the Hyksos out, 1560, enslaves the Israelites. At the beginning of the dynasty, he begins there, he says around 1570 BC or so. All right, Petrovich puts it at 1560. 1570 or so, but around the beginning of 18th dynasty, Egyptians reclaimed the region. They kicked the Hyksos out. It says new construction commenced. Well, we read in the Bible that the Israelites are to build the store city of Pithom. Right at that time, new construction commenced and the size of the city expanded. Many structures were built out of mud brick, and presumably the Semites there were conscripted into forced labor, as was common throughout Egypt during the New Kingdom period. In addition to houses and huts for residents, archaeologists have also excavated many round storage silos with structural diameters ranging from about 1 meter to 3 meters, or a diameter of about 3 feet to 10 feet. So these are storage. So they're building a storage city at Pithom. This is Pithom. And what do we find there? We find the city expanding, and we find storage silos there. It says, built using mud bricks. Similarities to other government-constructed silos elsewhere in Egypt indicate that these were commissioned by the royal administration. So they were being built pursuant to a government program, government authority. Then in the middle of the dynasty, subsequent to Thutmose III, and apparently during the reign of Amenhotep II, the city at Tel El Rataba, per Atum, Pithom, was mysteriously abandoned. It was not until more than a century later, at the beginning of the 13th century BC, during the reign of the 19th dynasty pharaoh Ramesses II, that the site was inhabited again. Due to its location in the Nile Delta or Goshen region, the name association with Peratum, Pithom, right? Its Semitic population, new construction at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, and then abandonment during the reign of Amenhotep, perhaps about 1446 when the Exodus occurred. Tel El Rataba was probably the site of Pithom, where many Hebrews lived and labored before their exit from Egypt. Okay, so I just think that's a really interesting thing. So they were told they're to build the store city of Pithom. They are to build the store city we see of Ramesses, and that's just an alternate spelling. Now they vowel pointed that in the Masoretic text there as Ramses, but it's the same city. So they were to build the store city of Ramesses, that's mentioned there in Exodus 1:11, and that's located at Tel El Daba, where we'd been looking before. We'd been looking at a lower level, the 19th century BC. So now we're up here in the 18th, in this period here, where we're going to have the Israelite slaves building this store city of Ramesses. And so this is going to be after 1560, and they're enslaved. And at the time the Israelite slaves built it, the city was called Perunefer. That's the name of, so you had Rawati, and when the Hyksos come in and take control over northern Egypt, they named that was their royal citadel, and they named that place Avaris. Now when they got kicked out by Amos, they then named that same area, that city, they named it Perunefer. So it is Perunefer when the Israelite slaves are building it or converting it into a store city. Now Kennedy, the archaeologist, he thinks that the city and the region may have been named for some kind of other Ramesses or something like that long before Ramesses II, who's in the 13th century. But as far as we know, okay, that city was not known as Ramesses until the 13th century BC. I want you to follow me on this, okay? That's down the road. That's in the 1200s. It wasn't known as Ramesses until the city was after Ramesses II. So that raises questions. So Ramesses II in the 13th century builds a massive city just northeast of the site of Tel El Daba, where we're just the adjacent place in the northeast. It's the archaeological site known as Cantir. And what happens is that city, Ramesses, comes to dominate in the whole area then is called Ramesses. So Rawati, Avaris, Perunefer, and then after Ramesses builds the great city here, the whole thing is called Ramesses. Okay? So that's what's going on. But if you're following me now, if Avaris/Perunefer, if it wasn't known as Ramesses until the 13th century BC, well then how could Moses write in the 15th century, right? Because Moses dies in 1406 before he goes into the Promised Land. How can Moses write in the 15th century BC that Israelite slaves a century before, in the mid-16th century BC, they built the store city of Ramesses? Okay, now this leads a lot of people off. They say, okay, so therefore he says built the store city of Ramesses, the Exodus must have occurred in the 13th century. Well, now you're blowing up all kinds of stuff. Okay? So that's called the late Exodus date. You have many people that think that, and I think it's not right. right? They're making a mistake there. The answer is that the city they built, the city was the city of Peru-Nefer that they built, that later became known as Ramesses. So they built the store city there. It was Peru-Nefer, but it later becomes known as Ramesses. In other words, the scribe or the inspired editor, as God is using people to put the scripture in the final form that he wants, whether it's a scribe or whether it's an inspired editor, that person who was copying Exodus centuries later updated the name of the city so people would know what you were talking about. If the name Peru-Nefer doesn't mean anything to me, and I'm copying this, and I then say, okay, that's the same place. It's the place you know as Ramesses. And you say, well, that seems kind of odd, but you have other evidence for that same thing happening. This idea of a scribal updating or an inspired editor updating the name of a location to make it relevant to the people at the time he's copying. Right, for example, in Genesis 47, so this is Genesis, right, 47:11, it says, then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, and the best of the land of Ramesses. Okay, so this is in 1876. Ramesses is until the 13th century. But he can call it the land of Ramesses. Now, why would he do that? He would do that so people would know what he was talking about. He says, as Pharaoh had commanded. Genesis 14:14 is another example. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Well, he's pursuing these four kings as far as Dan, but at that time the city wasn't Dan. The city was Laish or Laish. Right? It wasn't named Dan until it was taken over by the tribe of Dan around 1100 BC. And you see that reported in the book of Judges in chapter 18, verse 7 and 18:27. So there's precedent for it. And I think it's just a mistake that people then say, oh, this must have been then, and the Exodus must have been in the 13th century. Well, then you have to say, well, what about these texts that say it was 480 years before Solomon began to build the temple? Well, that must mean this. And you have all of these other problems. And then who is the Exodus? Who's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, it must be this guy. This guy doesn't fit. Whereas the person I'm going to talk to you about does fit, okay? So I think that's what's going on. So they build the store city of Pithom, which is Peru-Nefer, that later came to be known as Ramesses, and that's why it's referred to that way. Now, with regard to, here we are at Tel El Daba, and we're now up in this more recent range here. At the time, the Israelite slaves are commanded to build the store city here of Ramesses. And what do we see? That we have, at that site, we have these massive storage facilities here at this site, dating to the 18th dynasty. After Amos kicks the Hyksos out, makes them slaves, well, what do we have? Massive storage facilities here. Here's what Manfred Bitak, who you remember, he's an Austrian archaeologist. He was the excavator at Tel El Daba for a long time, 75 to 209, 66 to 69, I think, 75 to 209. So he says, at the northern sections of our excavations, the platform C of the late Hyksos period had been taken down during the early 18th dynasty. That's Amos's time. So it had been taken down and a storage compound set up on top of it. It consisted of at least 30 round grain silos, and other silos were found beside the palace in the south and at other places. Each silo was about 5.25 meters, 10 cubits in diameter. That's about 17 feet, the diameter of these silos. And so, yeah, they're building a store city there, I'll say. The silos were renewed up to 4 times, which would speak in favor of a long time span. This amenity was used to store enormous quantities of grain and probably other food stuff for a considerable number of people. It could have been a makeshift military facility for supplying troops. So here these Israelite slaves, we're told in Scripture, they built the store city of Pithom. They built the store city of Ramesses. And we have here Tel El Rataba. We have here Tel El Daba. Right there at the time, They're building, we see these things being converted into store cities. Now, as we follow the biblical chronology that I laid out for you in the first class, we follow this biblical chronology down to the time of Exodus, to the time of the Exodus, and we compare that to Petrovich's chronology of the pharaohs. The two come together beautifully. Remember Petrovich? He's a qualified archaeologist, doctorate from the University of Toronto, a minor in hieroglyphics, who's done a great deal of work here. And so when you compare that to his carefully worked out chronology of the pharaohs, they go together in really interesting ways. For example, we see that Aaron was born in 1529. That's the same year that Thutmose, Pharaoh Thutmose I, succeeded Amenhotep I as Pharaoh. So Aaron's born in 1429. Thutmose I comes to the rulership in 1529. We don't read anything about Aaron, any concern about Aaron being born and a danger to him of being killed at birth. We do read that 3 years later when Moses is born in 1526. Well, what could have happened? Well, we had a new Pharaoh come in right then. So apparently in that 3-year window from the time of Aaron's birth to Moses' birth, this new Pharaoh instituted a policy: we're going to kill the newborn Jewish men. And so that's just an interesting little connection there. Now here is the mummy of that actual Pharaoh. This is his body. And you see that there. And here is a statue of his head that's in the British Museum there of Thutmose I. And I'm convinced that's the Pharaoh that ordered the killing of the Jewish men, Jewish male babies. There he is. Now Hatshepsut, she was the daughter of Thutmose. This is a chart that I created from an online lecture. It's no longer online. You got to buy it. But I saw it some years ago. But Bryant Wood, who's an archaeologist, he had a lecture called The Pharaohs of the Bondage. And so I took this and created this chart from his lecture. But Hatshepsut, you see there, she's the daughter of Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose. And she's almost certainly the daughter of Pharaoh who rescued Moses from the river and raised him in the palace as her stepson. This Hatshepsut. And this chart, as I say, is from Bryant Wood. Now, here is Hatshepsut's mummy. So her body, it was positively identified in 2007. There was some question about it because it had been taken hidden. And then they found a tooth that was identifiable from where they found it, and that tooth fit perfectly in that mummy, complete with the broken root. So it was positively identified as the mummy of Hatshepsut in 2007. And here's a statue of her during better days, no doubt idealized to some degree, but there she is. Now, Thutmose I, what's up with this chart? Thutmose I, he dies in 1516, and he's succeeded by Thutmose II, who's Hatshepsut's half-brother. Okay, do you see what's going on here? I have the red is the royal line, and the underline is the Pharaoh. And the goal, what they want, is to unite the Pharaoh, the ruler, with the bloodline. And so, for example, Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose, they only have a daughter. They have Hatshepsut. Well, they want a male to be the Pharaoh. He has a son by another woman named Mutnefert. I love that name, Mutnefert. But he has a son by that woman, and that son is Thutmose II. So he becomes the Pharaoh. And then we have the same thing happens. So Thutmose II marries Hatshepsut, his half-sister, because they want to unite. They want to have a male from the bloodline. And so this wasn't unusual for that desire. Doing it other than wanting to unite to have the royal bloodline is one thing. But for this purpose, this was apparently accepted stuff. So Thutmose marries his half-sister, but they only have a daughter. And Thutmose, just like his dad, through another woman, Isis, he has a son, Thutmose III. Okay? So Thutmose III. Now what happens is Thutmose II, who has this son, Thutmose III, by Isis, He dies when Thutmose III is an infant or very young. And so too young to come to the throne, but he officially becomes Pharaoh. But who's really running things and acting on his behalf is Hatshepsut, his stepmother. You see, so this is what happened, and that's how you see Hatshepsut is underlined. Because Hatshepsut comes in and starts running the show with Thutmose III when he's in his childhood. And so she's basically the power of the throne and likes the idea and continues then as a co-regent, and she ran with it. I mean, she was Pharaoh. She even had images of her with the pharaonic beard. So she says, I'm Pharaoh. And all right, well, she was a co-regent with Thutmose III until she died in 1483. And so that's what's going on with that. So she assumes that role. Now, interestingly, we have Hatshepsut's mummy, and they examined her body, and they determined that she died sometime in her 50s, so 51 to 59. Now, what's interesting about that then puts her age at the time of Moses' birth between 7 and 16. And so she certainly could have been old enough, you see, to act to adopt Moses and take him into the palace and serve as his stepmother. Especially at that time when women had babies very young and were mothers very young. So that fits, right? That could have been a clinker. That could have ruled that out. But no, she's old enough to have been exactly what I think she was. She's the one who took Moses in. And so I think that's an interesting thing. Now in 1486, when Thutmose is now in his early 20s, okay, so he's in his early 20s. Hatshepsut at that time, the judged from her body that she was ill, and so at that time she's ill, whatever, and the young Thutmose III is feeling his oats, but he's in his early 20s, so that's when Moses killed the Egyptian, and he fled then to Midian because Thutmose was going to kill him. Was going to put him to death. And Scripture says that during the many days that Moses was in Midian, the king of Egypt died in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. So here's another little test. We have to have whoever this king is who's there when Moses winds up killing the Egyptian and fleeing. He has to stay on the throne a long time after that if it's going to fit with Scripture. And that's exactly what happens because that fits with Thutmose III. He reigned until 1450, which was 36 years after Moses fled to Midian. So it fits perfectly. He waits, and in 1450, he dies, and then his son, Amenhotep II, who had served as co-regent with Thutmose III for a few years at the end of Thutmose's life, but his son Amenhotep, he succeeds him as Pharaoh, and he comes to the throne as his own Pharaoh, sole Pharaoh, in 1450 BC. And about 4 years later, in 1446, that's when Moses returns from Midian, comes back to Egypt, and as God's spokesman, he demands that Amenhotep II free the Israelites. Now here's a statue of Amenhotep, and here's his mummy, which is in the Cairo Museum. And yeah, if John was here, I'd say, looks like him. Well, I might even say if it's not here. But, so this is Amenhotep II. Now, when you say that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Amenhotep II, and here's his mummy, questions immediately arise among Bible folk. I know how you are. Questions arise. Say, look, how could he be the Pharaoh of the Exodus when he obviously did not drown in the Red Sea during the Exodus in 1446, but he continued to reign down until 1416. Indeed, his mummified body is preserved. So how can he be the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And the answer is, in my judgment, is that Scripture does not demand that the Pharaoh of the Exodus drown. in the Red Sea during the Exodus. The text it doesn't say that expressly, and the text on which that conclusion is based, those texts leave ample room for doubt. I'm going to explain to you why I doubt that. Okay? In fact, I think it's not right. Exodus 14:4 and 14:17 to 18. I want you to see the distinction that is made. Okay, the inspired distinction that is made between Pharaoh and his host, his power, his military. You got Pharaoh and all his host. You've got Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots, his horsemen, his chariots, his horsemen. So you have a distinction made. There's Pharaoh, and then there's his military. There's Pharaoh and his hosts and his chariots and all of that. So you see that there. And in that light, Exodus 14:23 probably should be understood, and certainly can be understood, to mean that those who went into the parted Red Sea were the horses, the chariots, and the horsemen of Pharaoh, rather than Pharaoh himself. Okay, you see here, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea. Who went in? All of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And you see in 14:28, the waters returned and covered. Who did they cover? The chariots and the horsemen. All the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. Exodus 15:4, Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea. His chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. 15:19, the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea. Not Pharaoh. Pharaoh's military went in. You see that. You see, so the host of Pharaoh is said to be killed. All of these chariots, and presumably the horsemen as well, they were under the command of officers. All of these people were under the command of officers. You see that in Exodus 14:7. So you don't have to speculate that Pharaoh actually led the pursuit into the Red Sea rather than directing the pursuit from the rear. Ancient people understood very well the need to protect the king in battle. You can see that, for example, in 2 Samuel 18:2-3. 1 Kings 22:31-33. And though the Israelites, they were largely unarmed civilians, they were perceived by the Egyptians to be enough of a threat, given the power of the God they served, to warrant sending such a significant military force after them. So it's not crazy to think that Pharaoh would be directing the attack, knowing how valuable the king is. He would be directing the attack from the rear. And you see that in Exodus 15:4, it speaks of the chariots of Pharaoh and his host being cast into the sea. And then tellingly, it specifies his chosen officers. So these all had officers over them. They're put in the sea. So there's ample room for doubting this idea that Pharaoh himself was sunk in the Red Sea. Now, there are a couple of Psalms that need to be talked about in that regard. So here in Psalm 106:11, it simply says the water covered their adversaries. Okay, without specifying or without referring to Pharaoh. And then the most interesting one, I think the one that you could look at and say, well, this definitively says that Pharaoh died in the Red Sea, is Psalm 136:13-15. The key is verse 15, right? It says here, this is the English Standard Version, and it says, but overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever. Now, there are other translations that will say, for that verb overthrew, they will say hurled or tossed or swept Pharaoh and his host. So Pharaoh's definitely in there, right? And then they will take the preposition that the ESV says in the Red Sea. They will say into the Red Sea. So, right, if you read the Bible and say, listen, the Word of God says, God has revealed that he tossed Pharaoh into the Red Sea. Okay, well, then he tossed Pharaoh into the Red Sea. Right? If that's the truth, if that's what God has said and revealed, well, then that's the truth. And what I'm telling you wouldn't be right. Okay? I don't think that's the way to understand that. I think that's a mistake. For example, this verb overthrew. Na'ar means to shake off. Am I making that up? Well, here's just a standard Hebrew lexicon, Brown, Driver, and Briggs. Shake, shake out, or shake off. The Theological Workbook of the Old Testament, shake, shake out, or off. In fact, you see that meaning acknowledged in New American Standard Updated, New English Translation, the English Standard Version. They'll have a footnote and they'll say Hebrew to shake off. Okay? So that's what the word means. Na'ar means to shake off. And the preposition that is used there can mean at. Okay? Here you see Kohler and Baumgartner, which is another Hebrew lexicon, very well known, not making this stuff up. It can mean at. Okay, so here's what I think, how this ought to be understood. Goes on, it says, but shook off Pharaoh and his host at the Red Sea. They ditched them. They're pursuing them and they shook them off. They ended their pursuit at the Red Sea. How did they do it? By drowning Pharaoh's hosts and armies and chariots. Doesn't talk about Pharaoh. Okay? Doesn't talk about Pharaoh. Shook Pharaoh off and the host. So here they are pursuing. So I just don't think it's that specific. I don't think that rules out Amenhotep II. In fact, I'm really convinced Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So that's it. Now, certainly God, you say, well, it did say that God was going to gain glory over Pharaoh. It says that in Exodus 14:4, Exodus 14:17 and 18. But he doesn't have to kill Pharaoh to gain glory over him, does he? I mean, I don't see that at all. He can gain glory over him. I mean, administering a humiliating defeat to Pharaoh's army at the hands of a rabble of largely unarmed and recently freed civilian slaves certainly makes the point of God's supremacy over Pharaoh. Right? He gains glory over Pharaoh by just completely annihilating his army. He doesn't have to kill Pharaoh to do that. And he leaves in that process, he leaves no doubt that he could have taken Pharaoh's life anytime he chose. Because if you can whip the Egyptian army with this ragtag mob, well then killing Pharaoh's nothing. So I don't think, he doesn't have to kill Pharaoh for that to be true, that he gained glory over Pharaoh and his host. He gained glory over both of them by eliminating his military and defeating Pharaoh in such a humiliating fashion. So that's the first question that comes up when you say, listen, Amenhotep is the Pharaoh. How can he be the Pharaoh? He didn't drown in the Red Sea. My read is the Bible doesn't demand that the Pharaoh of the Exodus drowned in the Red Sea. Okay? If you think that's all wet, if you think, no, that's God does in fact say that Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, well then okay. Then you're going to say, I'm not buying what you're selling. All right, that's how it is. I've explained to you why I think that's not necessary. The second question that arises regarding the claim of Amenhotep that he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus is why he didn't die in the 10th plague that killed all the firstborn Egyptians. Because the idea would be he's on the throne, so presumably he is the eldest. And so the eldest dies, the firstborn son dies in the 10th plague. Why didn't he die? Well, we know the Exodus Pharaoh didn't die. And the answer is that he's not the eldest son. Right? That's exactly, he's not the eldest son. Thutmose III, his firstborn son was Amenemhet. That was his firstborn son. The older half-brother of Amenhotep II. He was in line for the throne, but he died before he could assume it. That's interesting. He was in line for the throne, but he died. And then Amenhotep becomes the Pharaoh. And of course, if Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, well then his firstborn son would have died in the plague, right? In the 10th plague. So if Amenhotep's successor, who's Thutmose IV, if he was his firstborn son, well then Amenhotep could not be the Pharaoh of the Exodus because his firstborn son didn't die, and we know the firstborn son died. But as you can imagine, okay, Thutmose was not Amenhotep II's eldest son. And that's clear from inscriptions and from other written documentation. So Amenhotep fits just very well here. And Pharaoh, as you know, when my view, Amenhotep, when the Pharaoh of the Exodus refuses God's demand through Moses to let the Israelites go, to free them, well, then that Pharaoh increased their hardship, right? They'd been slaves since Amos. But now when Moses comes, he increases their hardship by requiring them to gather their own straw for the bricks that they're enslaved to be making, and doesn't reduce their quota of bricks. So he makes it even harder for them. And interestingly, at least to me, the only scene that has been discovered in all of Egypt that shows the making of bricks is from the tomb of Rekhmire. There's Thutmose IV. I should have clicked that for you. But it's from the tomb of Rekhmire, who was an official in Thebes. And this tomb dates to the time of Amenhotep II. The one I'm telling you is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And it shows here's what Titus Kennedy says, on this tomb mural, a variety of slaves, including Asiatic or Semitic slaves, perform tasks for Egyptians. In particular, the slaves make bricks using mud and straw formed in a mold, dried in the sun, and then transported for use in construction projects. So this is in the reign of Amenhotep, the only image we have of slaves making bricks, and that's where it is. It's on this guy's tomb. And I find that of great interest, because that's what they had him doing. They had him making these bricks. All right, here's a site. This site here, you see marked there with the A, if you follow, make sure you're oriented here. Here's the delta, right? Tel El Daba right around in here. And you see this site here, southwest part of the Sinai. This is the Sinai Peninsula. All right, Canaan's up, Canaan land, the Levant is up here. In southwestern Sinai Peninsula, this is the location of a turquoise mine. A turquoise mine which the Egyptians exploited heavily. They mined this thing heavily from the 18th dynasty, Amos, through the 20th dynasty. So after the Hyksos had been expelled by Amos, they start exploiting this turquoise mine there at Serebet el-Kadim, and they do it with slave labor. And in 1905, the archaeologist Flinders Petrie, he found inscriptions there in an ancient script. And some date those inscriptions that he found there at Serebet el-Kadim. They date those to the Middle Kingdom period, so early, right? 2200 to 1675, something like that. All right, before Amos. So there are many people that date those inscriptions early like that. But Douglas Petrovich, he says all the evidence examined regarding the inscriptions from Serebet el-Kadim mitigates against their attribution to the Middle Kingdom, instead demanding that they be dated to the New Kingdom, specifically to the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II, the Exodus Pharaoh, so that they be dated there. Now, in 2016, Petrovich translated the inscription there that is known as Sinai 361. It's one of those inscriptions down there at Serebet el-Kadim. He translates that inscription. And here's what he says. This inscription says, "Our bound servitude, our slavery, had lingered. At that time, Moses provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the lady." Okay? So, our bound servitude had lingered? Moses provoked astonishment? Now, if that's right, and one of the things that I like, because Petrovich is willing to point out, you'll have people come and say, no, that's not right. Well, it's not like the guy's a clown. Okay, it's not like he's not trained in this stuff. And it's not like when he makes arguments for something, he doesn't break down everything and say, this character is this. Here's why I think it means that. This character is this, okay? But he points out that, look, they want to say that I have an agenda Everybody has a worldview. Right? Everybody has a worldview. They have an anti-biblical agenda. So they're bent on trying to interpret things that will say the Bible's not true. And he says, I just happen to believe the Bible is true. And so here you have this. If his translation is correct, it fits with an enslaved Israelite who's working in that mine during the period of Moses' interaction with Pharaoh, which interaction, when he was going back and forth with him, provoked astonishment among Israelites, but prior to the Exodus. So it would be right in that window, however long that was, those interactions were, that provoked astonishment. And the lady here, to whom he ascribes responsibility for this, as yet ineffective, because he's still a slave, a year of astonishment, is Baalith. Right? It's not the God of Abraham. This guy ascribes this astonishment to Baalith, the patron deity of this site of Serebet el-Kadim. And Petrovich says that deity, Baalith, is the feminine form of the divine name Baal or Baal. Hathor was the patron deity of the mining site at Serebet el-Kadim and was associated with Baalith, possibly because of the importance of each deity's role in sexuality. So you just have one of these confused people. Like I said, they engaged in idol worship. So here's this Israelite slave. Here's this character Moses. Moses is causing a lot of, they're astonished. He's stirring up stuff. What's going on? But he attributes it all to this pagan deity. Like when he says that it's because of the lady that this stuff is happening. And that's the way that kind of stuff works. All right, so I find that, again, very, very interesting. Now, I mentioned that after Amos, the bell's going to ring in 2 minutes and 5 seconds, so there you go. All right. After Amos expelled the Hyksos from northern Egypt around 1560 BC, the Egyptians, so the Hyksos had a royal stronghold, a royal citadel at Avaris. And after Amos kicks them out, the Egyptians, they destroyed Avaris, but the Egyptians, they need a stronghold there, because they had lost northern Egypt for more than a century. So they want to make sure that they've got a military base and a stronghold there in the Delta. Archaeologist Gary Byers, he says, while the national capital for the 18th dynasty pharaohs was in Memphis, 13 miles south of Cairo, after the Hyksos experience, a royal presence would always have been seen as necessary for national security in the Nile's eastern delta. And so after they got rid of the Hyksos, they took Avaris and made it into their royal citadel. And they built with Israelite slave labor, they built palaces there. And at the time, you can see here, this is a shot. This is the location of the Egyptian palace complex during the time of Moses and Amenhotep. It's right on the most eastern tributary of the Nile. And so they built this here, and you see there where it's located. And at the time of Moses, this complex was this specific area, about 13.6 acres. And they built 3 palaces here. Right in that circle. You can't see them there, but I'm going to give you a blow up, you'll see them. 3 palaces they built at that site, and they had a large artificial lake that separated 2 of the palaces. And one of these palaces may very well have been where Moses and Aaron confronted Amenhotep. Right here by that water, where they go and confront Amenhotep. Now here is the close-up. This is a layout of the Egyptian palace. I heard that bell, but let me at least point these things. You see there are 3 palaces. There's Palace F, there's Palace G, and there's Palace J. And there's the artificial lake between them. But you can see this is big doings. And this was built by the Egyptians after they kicked out the Hyksos, and this is built by Israelite slave labor. They go ahead and they build this palace. They need their labor, and they did the store city work. So all of this just fits so beautifully, but of course you have voices that are going, that's not true, the Bible's not true. Okay, all right, Bible's true, baby. All right, thanks.